Welcome everyone to ABE and College ESL Unite. Betsy and I are thrilled to be here today to talk about how we can prepare and support adult ESL students who want to move toward higher education of any kind, be it a 1-year or 2-year program or a traditional 4-year degree. We are both teacher educators and have more than 50 years of combined experience, but we also continue to teach in our fields. I teach EAP courses, and Betsy mostly teaches in adult education. We've been comparing notes on our respective fields for a long time, and it's through these conversations and our own experience and research that we know there's a lot we can do to prepare adult ESL students for the rigors of EAP programs and college coursework. We also know it's important that college faculty understand the needs and challenges of adult ESL students. We believe we need a collaborative approach for our fields where we all try to understand the demands and challenges students face in each context. Okay, here's the agenda for the rest of the webinar. I will start off discussing the kinds of coursework adult ESL students can expect in an EAP program, and then Betsy will discuss some more of her research and suggestions for refining adult ESL lessons with an eye toward the demands of higher education. Then we'll be happy to take some of your questions. Okay, let's talk about what EAP programs emphasize. I've been teaching for over 22 years and I've specialized in teaching EAP and EAP writing. And I would like to give you an overview of what happens in a typical EAP program. Now, EAP programs do vary. And some EAP programs do things that are very specific to the college where they're located. But many of the things that I'm going to share with you now to give you a flavor of EAP programs are common across EAP programs. So what do EAP programs emphasize? They tend to emphasize reading and writing skills. And that's because they're often timed to entrance and exit exams. Many students have to take writing exit exams to move to the next level or to matriculate. And it's true that we are moving toward all skills assessments, but reading and writing still are primary because they're still primary in college. The main way students are assessed in college today is still around reading and writing, even though they often get a participation grade and have to give presentations. And in EAP programs, when we do practice speaking and presentation skills, they're often text-based as well. So for example, students might be given an article to read and then they have to moderate a discussion around that article. Or if they give a presentation, they're giving a research presentation where they've had to read the literature in some area and then present. We also highlight research skills and grammar and vocabulary for academic discourse. And I'm going to talk about these different areas now. So what are some common tasks and assignments in EAP that adult ESL students would face if they joined an EAP program? In terms of reading and writing, the focus for reading is really on non-fiction informational texts. This is in contrast to many programs in adult ESL that might focus more on narrative or fiction. And there's also an emphasis in EAP programs on reading to respond in writing. There's a very strong link between reading and writing. Students are often asked to read a type of essay, for example, a compare-contrast essay, and then write their own compare-contrast essay. In terms of writing skills, there are so many, and I'm just giving you a highlight here of some of the key things we do a lot in EAP. We focus a lot on summary writing and paraphrasing, because those are so critical and foundational to all writing in academia. And also because those skills are very difficult to master. Even native speakers struggle with those skills. We also focus on responding with evidence. We teach students about valid evidence for their ideas and then ask them to incorporate different types of evidence in their writing. Another thing that's maybe unique about EAP versus adult ESL is the focus on essay writing and moving away from the paragraph into longer writing. It's true that some EAP programs at the lowest level would start with paragraph writing, but those students will quickly move into essay writing. Here are some writing modes that we would focus on in an EAP program, because these are aligned with the variety of writing modes in college. Modes like argument and cause and effect, problem solution, summary response, lab reports, synthesis papers where students have to read multiple texts and then make connections across texts, and then short answer and exam writing. And then discussion blog writing is something that's coming up a lot today in EAP programs, because in college today, most students have to work in a LMS, a learning management system like Canvas or Blackboard. And in those systems, there's a discussion feature. And most professors today ask students to do short responses in that discussion feature. So I would say the key difference between adult ESL and EAP in terms of writing is the emphasis on information and analysis of sources rather than narrative or personal experience. What about research and skill building? We focus a lot in EAP on how to help students use outside sources, to understand what an outside source is and how we use them, and how we use them to support our ideas in writing. We focus on citation style guides like MLA, APA, and Chicago, the basics of those. And we try to strongly tie that to how to avoid plagiarism, because that's something that's so prevalent in college today. In terms of EAP Grammar and Vocabulary, there tends to be a focus on grammar for writing and a purpose-based approach to teaching grammar. And this is different from other ESL programs that might focus their grammar on the level. So for example, perhaps a program will teach the present progressive in an advanced beginner level because they feel that's a grammar point that's right for the level. In EAP, we tend to pick the grammar point for what we're asking students to write, and I'll give some examples of that in a minute. We also focus on high frequency academic vocabulary and on longer chunks of language, not just teaching individual terms. And I'll give some examples of that in just a moment too. But back to EAP grammar. There is, again, because writing is so important, there is a tendency to focus on grammar for writing and to take a purpose-based approach. This approach ties grammar to the purpose for writing, and it ties it to a particular mode, like the modes that I showed you in the previous slide. It also uses examples from academic texts. So when we might not look at examples from textbooks so much, but actually take an academic article and find the grammar points there to use as authentic examples. This approach also uses grammar to teach students about the writing modes themselves. And I will show you an example of that in just 1 minute. But before I do that, I'd like to read this quote by Diane Larson Freeman on a purpose-based approach to grammar, which is what I'm calling it. While rules provide some security for learners, reasons give them a deeper understanding of the logic of English and help them make it their own. This is a purpose-based approach, in my view, focusing on the reasons to write or the reasons for using a particular grammar point. So what would that look like in concrete terms in the classroom? Well, for me, that would mean if I'm teaching a unit on summary writing, my focus is going to be on reporting verbs. And you might say, oh, wow, EAP seems like so advanced. Why would we do such maybe a lower level grammar point? But the truth is the students need accurate reporting verbs in order to write an accurate summary. So it's important to teach them how to use reporting verbs accurately and how to use reporting verbs with variety. Many students, you might have noticed, will use the same reporting verb again and again, and it might not accurately describe the moves the writer is making. So this will be a large focus in my summary writing unit in terms of the grammar, because it's going to help students write what I'm asking them to write. It's also going to teach them about the mode itself, right? It's going to teach them that summary writing is an accurate reporting of the original. Another example is problem solution writing, which I do quite a bit with my students. And if I'm going to choose a grammar point for this mode, I would choose infinitive phrases, because the infinitive phrase you can see here in the examples does a really good job of setting up the solution in the main clause, right? So for example, to ensure educational equity, the government should, I don't know, we'd have to complete that sentence, maybe give equal funds to all school districts, right? That might be a solution. So I'm going to teach infinitive phrases because that's what students need to write a problem solution paper. And one more example on this, if I'm teaching cause and effect, I might teach students these common phrases. X is one effect of Y, or one effect of X, or as a result. And then also this adjective plus effect or adjective plus cause combination. So one negative effect of, or the underlying cause of. You can see that this language is the language they need to write. So that's the link between teaching grammar for writing rather than teaching grammar for the level. In terms of EAP vocabulary, there's an emphasis in EAP on using the academic word list terms. So the academic word list is a list of words that show up with high frequency in academic texts, and you can find it easily online. Just you can Google the AWL. But we also focus on longer chunks of language, moving away from teaching just the individual term and teaching collocations and phrases. So let me give you some examples of these. But before I do that, oh, here's my example, I'm sorry, of the academic word list terms. So you can just take a look at this list, establish, factor, highlight, illustrate, and you can see how these words will help students develop an academic voice in writing. And Paul Nation says, instruction should be directed toward the high frequency words of the language. Where learners are going on to academic study, this would also include the academic word list vocabulary. The benefits of knowing high frequency vocabulary balance the time and effort required for direct vocabulary instruction. So in EAP, we draw heavily on the academic word list, and the counterpart in adult ESL out there might be the general service list, the GSL, which are high frequency words in English. But as I said before, we don't just teach individual terms from the academic word list, we try to teach longer chunks of language like the ones you see here: legal system, economic factors, social safety net, human rights. You can see that some of the academic word list terms show up in these collocations like system and factors. And the reason that we want to focus on longer chunks of language is because it will make students' writing sound more natural, more advanced, more academic, and oftentimes more concise. So sometimes students will have a very long phrase that you can help guide them toward just writing one collocation. For example, you could say a system of laws that govern a country, or you could just say a legal system. And I help students a lot with that in terms of wordiness and coming down and being more concise with a collocation. And then you see some examples of lexical phrases here: on the one hand, on the other hand, in order to, in addition to. These help us transition and create coherence, and there's a number of other uses for them. But in EAP, this is our focus, moving away from the individual term into longer chunks of language. This is my final slide in my section. It's a recap of the areas of focus in EAP. The emphasis of reading nonfiction versus fiction in adult ESL very often. The strong link between reading and writing. So students are asked to read something and then write about it, or read an essay in a particular mode and then write in that mode. The fact that we write in academic modes rather than free writing or personal experience writing. And then this idea of grammar for writing. So not grammar for the level, but grammar that is purpose-based for the mode that you're asking the students to write in. And then finally, vocabulary is high frequency academic vocabulary, and teaching longer chunks rather than teaching individual terms. I hope my section of the presentation has given any adult ESL educators out there a flavor of what EAP programs focus on and what your adult ESL students who want to go toward higher ed would face in our courses. And now I'm going to turn it over to Betsy.
Thank you so much, Jeanne. I'm always inspired when I hear you, when I have conversations with you, and I'm also inspired to see so many people joining us today, given the circumstances in the world. So thank you for taking time to be here. I'm going to talk to you about my experiences working in the area of adult ESL here in the United States, but I've also worked with a lot of teachers abroad in a variety of countries. And I think a lot of us face the same issues and concerns. And one of the things that I would like to start off with is sharing with you some research that my colleague, Kim Johnson, and I did. It's been 10 years now. We did some research on the experiences of community college faculty and the needs that they think learners have. We asked them to talk to us about what academic skills and strategies are essential for success in their settings. And these college faculty were from developmental education, they were from pre-nursing, and even from construction, and they were all working in 2-year degree programs. So this wasn't 4-year college. So we asked them what was really essential. And we found many of the same things that Jeanne talked about. And one of them that really stood out for me was that college faculty said that being able to synthesize information from multiple texts, multiple sources, is extremely important for success. So 52% said that was extremely important for success in their settings. However, we asked adult education teachers and high-level ESL teachers how often they taught that skill. And we found that only 82% said they rarely or never addressed those skills in their instruction. Another thing we found was that there were some writing needs that were very really apparent in community college. For example, in this setting with 2-year degrees, 33% of the college faculty assigned research papers. And remember that this was not a 4-year college, this was 2-year community or technical college. And even there, 33% were assigning research papers. However, only 4% of adult ed or ESL instructors at the highest levels were assigning that kind of work. But as Jeanne has pointed out, and as we all know, research is really prevalent in any kind of academic language and in any type of academic setting. Now, we might think that things have changed quite a bit because with the advent of the college and career readiness standards here in the United States and some other frameworks around the world that are really pushing us to promote more rigorous instruction, we've seen a shift, and we've seen that people are teaching academic reading and writing that's going beyond some of the basic skills like skimming and scanning or writing short narrative reports. However, in a really recent study from 2017, Fernandez, Payton, and Schatzel found that in their survey of over 270 teachers, they're still teaching mostly narrative genre. Their primary writing tasks were working on grammar and punctuation, doing class notes, short answers to essays, or short biographical or personal writing. So things haven't changed as much as we'd like to think, perhaps. So we really need to think about promoting writing instruction that reflects the actual demands that learners face for further training or education, or English for academic purposes. So what I'd like to focus on is an example that I've used in my own teaching that draws on learners using their own experiences and talking with each other in order to develop content to write about. And then we'll move to talking about an example using readings, current readings on a current topic, something that's on our minds for all of us right now. So for this example, we're going to think about how we can use learner input as the basis for academic writing. And while this is, taking a more of a personal approach in the world of adult ESL, which isn't uncommon, we're going to see that we can at the same time put a high focus on some of the academic skills that Jeanne talked about. And I do apologize, I just jumped one slide. So first of all, we're going to start off by thinking about the context of caring for the elderly around the world. This is a topic I chose with my students because it's something that we can all relate to, right? We can all talk about this topic. It also is a topic that you might find in a career type program, let's say a pre-nursing or nursing program, So I was working with teachers who taught general ESL, but I was also working with teachers who were in a nursing program. So we start off by talking about, what do you see? Which of these is in a home? Which of these is in a care facility? So by using pictures like this, we can even start practicing one of the skills that Jeanne noted, which was finding evidence to support a claim. So if I say that the picture on the left is in the home, my evidence might be that the son seems to be holding his grandmother, whereas somebody in a care facility probably wouldn't do that. Or the other picture on the right is in a cafeteria, and we see people in uniforms. So from there, then students are going to collect information from one another about practices in their countries. For example, where do elderly usually live? Who has the responsibility of caring for aging parents? And who makes decisions? Who makes medical decisions for sick parents? Students would do this as a mingle activity in class, standing, interviewing, doing note-taking to collect information that then they can talk about and write about. Next, students are put into teams, and each team is assigned one of those original questions. So for example, one team might look at, where do the elderly usually live? And they look at the information that they've gathered through their interviews, and they try to make some inferences. Well, we noticed a lot of people said that the elderly seem to live with the eldest child. Maybe that's one thing they found when they interviewed others in class. What are some possible reasons for these practices? Well, maybe it's cultural beliefs, or maybe it's geography. Do they live nearby? They would make some suggestions, but you'll notice that we have phrases that we would provide for students, making inferences with phrases like, maybe it's because, it could be that, it would seem that. Now, I know that Jeanne was talking a lot about reading and writing, but she also mentioned how a lot of times there's a lot of speaking involved. And I think one of the benefits of starting off with these very robust academic conversations with students before you expect them to write is that they can build confidence with that academic language, and they're more likely to apply that academic language to their writing. After students have explored one of the questions in depth in their small groups, now we're going to take a jigsaw approach, take one member from each of those teams, create new groups, and present their findings for their question to others in small groups. So remember, Jeanne talked about the need for doing sort of academic presentations. That was one of the things that Kim and I found in our study, was that adult ESL teachers don't do nearly as much in the way of presentations in class as we find in English for academic purpose programs or in college and for careers. So this is a way to do mini presentations within your instruction on whatever the topics are you're covering. But you'll also notice that we're giving more paragraph frames for them to engage with others during their presentation, so that people can, for example, in this instance, show agreement or show disagreement about what they're hearing. And then finally, students are going to take all of this information they've gathered, first through the interview, through looking closely at the data or information they gathered from each other, having a discussion with others, and then use a paragraph frame for some writing. This is an example of a very short 2-paragraph essay, which might be, typical in an adult ed program. These scaffolds give the kinds of supports that Jeanne talked about, where we're giving lexical phrases such as because of these similarities, or these differences may mean. We're not, we're teaching the language, the grammar, the forms, and the functions that people need for this purpose. So in this case, it's writing a report. And you'll also notice that it focuses on compare and contrast. Okay, so Jeanne also talked about letting the grammar be purpose-based, taking that purpose-based approach. So as students have gathered information from each other, that's a form of research. No, they're not going out to texts yet. They're not reading articles or reports, but they're gathering information from each other, and they're having to synthesize that information and then report it to others. So this might be a chance to work on the kind of reporting language, such as our class results show that, or interview results suggest, or we found that, or over half the group report that the elderly normally live with their children, or we found that in the United States, many people live in assisted living. So this is a chance to focus on the language, the forms, and academic language functions, you notice at the phrase level, but also in service of the writing genre, not in isolation or out of context. Now, this is a great time to move to looking at doing some reading and sending students at this point to some really rich, excuse me, I do apologize, I'm sorry. We're going to explore the topic in more depth, and we're going to think about it in this current situation today. So we've been talking about the elderly, decisions about the elderly, and in this past week, I've noticed a lot of articles on isolation among seniors who can't be with their family because of COVID-19. They're at a higher risk due to isolation and loneliness. So there are many, many short blog posts, there are many longer articles. There's a whole array of reading out there that we can send students to. So in this instance, we're going to identify some of the problems that are in the readings and then have the students think about solutions. So as many of you have gone to teaching online right now, as I have as well, what I'm doing a lot of is having students use shared Google Docs to pull together the information that they're gathering through the readings and the activities that we're doing. So let's see what that could look like. I created a Google Doc with a chart, and all the students need to do is go in as they're doing the reading on their own time and fill in the problems they've identified. So in this instance, we found these problems so far. Family members can no longer visit. The elderly don't have technology for communicating. I mean, all of us are using things like Zoom and Google Hangout to stay in touch, but the elderly may not have those resources or that know-how. And maybe the staff are too busy to assist. And then finally, those living at home, that are elderly, they might be living at home, but they can't interact. They're living in a room in isolation. So students then go in and suggest, well, what could we do about that? Well, maybe we could try using WhatsApp, or find out if the center has some technology that the residents could use. Or maybe we could make art for our loved ones and share that through some windows. Or what about if we were to play music outside? So this is a way for students to engage virtually, remotely, in sharing their ideas about readings they've found. This is a technique you could obviously use face-to-face, but I wanted to share an idea of how you might apply this within our current context. So now there's language that we could work on with the students. It's one of the ones that Jeanne highlighted before. In order to write a response, we could use those infinitive phrases. For example, to ensure the well-being of the elderly, families should find a way to communicate through technology, or families could ask staff to sit down with their parents using WhatsApp on their phone. Or to increase virtual interactions, maybe staff could help the residents use the computers that are at the assisted living home, for example. So Jeanne showed you how this might look using really more advanced content, but we could be teaching these same functions, academic language functions, phrases, and genres of writing, even at beginning through intermediate levels of adult ESL. My examples here have been kind of in the middle level, but the techniques themselves could be used really at any level. We just need to change the level of language that we present and the level of texts that we provide. Okay, so to wrap up, the idea here for adult ESL is that we really want to find ways to make instruction really rigorous. We want to promote opportunities for students to engage with more interesting, high interest content. We want to give them the scaffolds they need, though, to be able to access that content. So for example, we can have them read and fill in the chart. So read and use a graphic organizer. Or we can use more of a jigsaw reading or paired reading approach, where different students are assigned different texts to read, so that they're given access to these informational texts, but they're not overwhelmed with the amount of reading and the level of language. Another type of activity that I didn't show you, but I use a lot, is one question survey. So instead of using the interviews and filling in the graphic organizer to gather information from one another, each student is given a one sentence interview question with tailing marks. So they do a poll on a particular question. This is really suitable for beginning level students, where they just ask a question like, where do the elderly live in your family? At home? In a nursing home? With the son, with the daughter? Just giving a one-word answer and having the students tally their results. So we can use that technique with beginners. Then we can gather and analyze and graph our data or present our data in different ways to each other. Finally, you notice that there's a lot of, I provided a lot of academic language frames. And then finally, we want to do everything we can to have students produce real-world products that demonstrate their learning, that look more like what you might do in an academic setting. So that would be things like the shared Google Doc. That's something that is often done in college settings, or writing a report, but also things like creating a presentation, a PowerPoint, or a poster to present to others in class. So as you're looking at this list, you can be thinking about how this might happen online. And again, with shared Google Docs or forms or Kahoot, we can have students create short quizzes for each other. It's a challenge, but there are many ways that we can bring some of these into an online environment. But the idea here is that we want to find every way we can to give students this opportunity to work with different genres in multiple formats, high interest topics. And what's key is giving them the supports and the scaffolds they need to be successful. So here's our references you can take a look at later, but now we would like to open it up to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Betsy and Jeanne. I think this is very interesting with adult ed and ABE students having to learn language and skills that are moving closer to what students are learning in academic English classes. So I think there's a lot more in common that we initially thought, or we are aware of. So this is very interesting. So if anyone has any questions, if you could type them in the questions box and we'll be able to answer them. And while we wait for those questions to roll in, I'd just like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. And a link to the recording, along with a link to download your certificate of participation, will be emailed to you in about 1 to 2 weeks. See if we have any questions. We had one earlier. I think this one may be for Jeanne. Do you have any books or references with that has reporting verbs that students can look at or have referred to?
Okay, great question. And thank you, Betsy, for that. Those really helpful examples of how you can sort of refine some of the adult ESL lessons to move toward a higher ed context. I found that was very helpful. In terms of books on reporting verbs, I don't have a book recommendation that's just on reporting verbs alone, but a number of academic titles do include practice of reporting verbs. My own series, Final Draft, which is published by Cambridge University Press here, does cover reporting verbs in the summary writing sections. And I'm pretty certain also that the grammar textbook series, Grammar and Beyond, which is also a Cambridge title, also includes practice of reporting verbs. So that's likely how you will find, you won't necessarily find a book that's just on reporting verbs, but you'll find it in these other series.
Great, thank you. Let's see.
Can I just add one more thing to that, Kyoko?
Yeah, of course.
You can just find a lot of reporting verbs that you want to create your own activities with by just looking for them in an article. So just choosing an article that you'd like your students to read, and you can just sort of from there come up with your own list of reporting verbs based on what the writer is doing. Is the writer explaining something, or is the writer arguing? And you can come up with your own list for the article that your students are asked to read.
right, thank you, Jeanne. I'm not sure which, I think maybe a question for both of you. What level would you recommend we start teaching academic writing?
If I could take that, I'd love to. I'll start with that. Okay, I would say at the very beginning, if we define academic writing more broadly. So for example, sometimes I use a very short biography of President Obama as a mentor text, as a model text. And in that text, you see that there's a chronology. The students read it and they fill in a graphic organizer that looks like a timeline with the important events in his life. And then I invite them with a highlighter to note, well, what are the different verbs? What are the different time phrases we see here, from this date to this date? Then the students have this, like I said, as a mentor text, and they can fill in a graphic organizer with the events in their own lives and then write a personal biography. So that's an example of where it's a more academic genre to do biography than just a simple story about holidays. And also we can make a point of highlighting the academic language that's in that text. So I don't know if you want to add anything, Jeanne, but I would say at all levels, we can be introducing the ideas of different genres by looking at the structure. Is it a chronology? Is it a process? Are there steps? First you do this, then you do that. So it might, like I said, look very different from what Jeanne was showing us, but I think it's a way to start.
Yeah, Betsy, I think that's great. I think it is good to start in adult ESL, especially in a program where you know that students want to go on to higher ed, some form of higher ed, because landing in an EAP program can be sort of a shock to the system. And I think if we can start preparing them in adult ESL more, that'll make a smoother transition for the students from adult ESL to EAP, English for academic purposes. I noticed that I didn't say that full at the beginning. Sorry about that. I think the social distancing is getting to me, but EAP is English for academic purposes. But I think that it's important to start sooner than when they get to EAP. Because I think just the more that they're prepared, it's going to make a smoother transition.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add in.
Yeah, the activity. I was just going to say the activities will look different. I don't think that we want to communicate that you should just turn an adult ESL program into an EAP program. It's more about finding ways in to academic skills.
Right. And I think it's about those skills. So even if you're teaching content in English, there's the other question here about ABE. And I'm sorry too that I didn't define that. Adult basic education here in the States. That's adult education for adults post high school, but pre-college. So in that setting, there might, for example, for ESL, there may be newcomers who do need some basic life skills on how to navigate their neighborhood, how to use the banking system, those sorts of things. But we can teach the content in such a way that we're also promoting the kinds of skills that our research shows are needed and that Jeanne shared with us from her teaching context. So for example, we could have people survey each other through one question survey about different services in the community, tally the results and create graphs or summaries of where do people shop in my neighborhood. So it could be something that's a kind of a basic life skills topic, but we can teach it so that we're promoting the skills.
Great, thank you. We have some comments rolling in saying what a great webinar and how useful the information was. So that's good to hear. Okay, we have another question here. So it's a participant from Brazil. Says noun phrases are a problem to Brazilians. We work with them to observe the different word order English follows and word formations as well, but how can we use these in academic writing?
How to help prepare?
Yeah, how to help students write with the problems they're having with noun phrases and incorporate that into teaching academic writing.
I mean, I can start off on that. I mean, one of the things that I would want to do with any grammar point that students are struggling with is do noticing activities. So if you can get a good text with examples and do noticing activities with the students. I think that's the first thing to do. That will create awareness around the word order. And then after that, when they're actually experimenting in their own writing, then that's when your corrective feedback can come in. And we don't have time to do a whole webinar on corrective feedback, although I know that Cambridge has one that could probably be sent out. I've done webinars on corrective feedback, but helping students to identify their own errors, and awareness through noticing, and then awareness through noticing their own errors.
Yeah.
Betsy, I don't know if you
yeah, I just want to second this as an approach. I just want to second the approach in general when you're teaching any of this language and any grammar, is using a very contextualized inductive approach, finding materials or setting up a context where that language feature will naturally occur, and then drawing, in the case of students who are not as advanced, kind of drawing their attention to it, finding ways through the checking questions you ask to help them notice the features in the language. Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Jeanne. I think that's a great approach to take.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one last question. This is kind of open-ended. There's someone asking if you've ever taught EFL. If so, was it hard? Did you find it harder versus ESL?
I think I'm going to give this to Betsy, because Betsy, I think you have an EFL.
I taught abroad for over 5 years in France, and then I've also worked with teachers in India and Bangladesh and Vietnam and in Russia. And yeah, I think the challenges are that, of course, not all EFL contexts have monolingual classes, because you could have, I find in France, there was some diversity in terms of linguistic backgrounds in my classes in France. So students from other parts of the world who spoke French as an additional language, or multilingual learners themselves. But yes, I think it's sometimes more challenging to kind of motivate students or give them reasons to work as much as they can in English. I don't really believe in sort of an English only policy, but I do agree that we want to find ways to promote reasons to communicate. And I find personally that this approach that Jeanne and I are talking about tends to do that actually really well. Let's say, as compared to reading and answering comprehension questions or doing fill in the blank activities or kind of decontextualized grammar, I think that's not nearly as cognitively demanding or engaging as having to read a text and complete a graphic organizer and then present that to somebody else. So it's inherently more interesting, more engaging, I think, and it tends to motivate learners to really work their, the hardest they can to communicate as much as they can in the target language. The other thing, though, is that I may, this is a time where I might send students to source material in their first language and really be able to dig deeply into a topic, and then bring that content knowledge together, maybe together as a team, present a presentation, create a poster, a PowerPoint, doing that in English. I don't know if that's partly what I imagine you're getting at, is that challenge. But I had successes with teachers in Vietnam and in India and Bangladesh using these more collaborative experiential approaches, even within their contexts that were low resourced, by certain adjustments to their teaching, their thinking about how they would approach the material could really help a lot.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. I think personal experiences always help other teachers out to, kind of understand a little bit better of the situation they might not have been in before. So, and I think we're just about out of time. So thank you again to Betsy and Jeanne for that great presentation. And thank you everyone for attending. And I know it's late for some of you, and so thank you for staying up late to join us. And to the rest of you, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And again, we'll be sending that email out with a link to the recording and the certificate in about 1 to 2 weeks.